Well, hello, good morning. How is everybody? Thank you very much indeed, and a very warm welcome to day 2 of the Railway Industry Association's annual conference 2024. I hope those of you who went to the dinner last night had a great time. Did you? I heard that there was dancing until 2 o'clock in the morning, and I did hear a whisper that there was somebody who went to bed at 5. Does anyone want to own up to that? No. Pardon? He's manning the stand. Should we shame him? Okay, all right. Okay, well, I think that's pretty awesome, the fact that he's manning the stand and still went to bed at 5. So he's obviously a party boy. I'm really glad you had such a great night last night, and thank you for being here on time so beautifully, punctually this morning. I would like to take this opportunity once again to thank all of our sponsors, BAM Nuttall, the Platinum sponsor, CPC Project Services, the Gold Dinner and Drinks sponsor, Arcadis, our gold badge sponsor, and Waterman Aspen, the gold badge sponsor. Sorry, I can't even read my own writing. That's Arcadis. And Waterman Aspen, the gold bag sponsor. So all of you, thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. Now, the theme of this year's conference asks the question, doesn't it? A fresh start for UK Rail? Well, yesterday we heard from really some amazing speakers, including the Rail Minister, Lord Peter Hendy, Chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, Sir John Armitt, the Chair of HS2, Sir John Thompson, and last night, Angie Dole, CEO of Govia Thameslink Railway, and of course, many more. It seems clear to me from yesterday's discussion that the future of rail does look very different to previous years, with many new opportunities, as well, of course, as the challenges, and that a fresh start is indeed in prospect. We are, of course, going to investigate that a little further today, and I hope, like me, you found yesterday's discussions, interviews, really stimulating. I really did find yesterday truly fascinating. Before we kick off, though, I would like to remind you, if you haven't done so already, the RIA team really do encourage you to download the RIA app so that, amongst other things, you can access the event directory, connect with other delegates, see conference agenda updates, more of that in a moment, and use the app to ask questions if you'd rather not ask them in front of your colleagues and peers. We do have another excellent day lined up for you at conference, but I am going to tell you about some enforced changes. And if you'd got the app, you'd know about this already, because we have had to make some changes to the programme, which we only found out very late last night. Network Rail CEO Andrew Haynes has had to go on rather urgent government visit to Manchester, and that's been very short notice this morning. So he can't actually attend the conference in person. and it's outside of his control. However, we have rescheduled a live interview with Andrew, which will be down the line at 1:45 today. I'll interview him then, and I'll try and include as many of your questions as possible to him. That's at 1:45. Anit Chandara, Network Rail's Group Director and Systems Operator, whose slot Andrew was taking, is now going to be on at 3 before we close the conference at 3:30, which of course leaves the slot this morning, it's like a puzzle, isn't it, where Andrew Haynes was due to speak. Well, fortuitously, Clive Berrington, who works just down the road in Waterloo, has agreed to come in and take that slot. So Clive Berrington, as many of you know, is Network Rail's Group Director, Railway Business Services, and he might be able to comment on some of the points made yesterday about how suppliers are actually finding CP7. So there's lots of moving parts. I consider it a bit of an upgrade for all of us. We're getting a triple Network Rail whammy, 10:45 with Clive, 1:45 down the line with Andrew, and 3 with Anit. So that's just to establish where we are. Note your app. Before all that, and for the first time in history, at the RIA annual conference, we're now going to be party to a live podcast discussion on the RIA stage, as you can see here, all set and ready. Richard Bowker, former chairman of the Strategic Rail Authority, together with renowned rail journalist and commentator Nigel Harris, set up the Green Signals podcast back in October 2023. It's now become a regular must-listen to and watch media channel by literally thousands of people at all levels interested in the railway industry. After the podcast, I'm going to have a bit of a chat with both of them and find out how and why the podcast was set up. But before that, please welcome Richard and Nigel to the stage, together with their guest, the renowned railwayman, Chris Green, for the latest edition of Green Signals podcast. Please give them a huge round of applause.
Thank you, Natasha, for that build-up. And welcome to Green Signals, a live podcast, our first, live at the Railway Industry Association conference at the Leonardo Hotel, Tower Hill, with me, Nigel Harris, and
me, Richard Bowker.
And our guest, Chris. We're live on YouTube as we speak. So we're also recording the live show for publishing on our other platforms later today. Just one bit of housekeeping. The live feed camera is direct line of sight at the back there on that tripod. If you do need a PNB, please try and avoid walking straight across the camera, or even worse, congregating to chat in front of it at the back. Somebody will hack your ankles if you do that, so please try and avoid that. So we're going to dispense this week with our usual podcast segments, so I'm afraid no quiz this week, so I shall have to find another reason to give Richard a hard time. But instead, we'll dive straight into a discussion with our very special guest. In fact, it's the essence of special guest today. Chris Green really does need no introduction, but I'll give him a little one anyway. Joined BR as a graduate management trainee in 1965, and I think did his first shift in Fenny Compton signal box. As a box lad, didn't you, Chris? There you go. General Manager, ScotRail, 1980 to 1985. MD Network South East, 1986 to 92. Managing Director, InterCity, 92 to 94. Non-Exec Director, Eurotunnel. Chair of the Safety Committee, 1995 to 2004. Chief Executive, Virgin Trains, 1999 to 2004, when I think both of the other people on the stage here came across each other. Non-Executive Director at Network Rail, 2005 to 10, and an independent advisor to TfL for the Elizabeth Line, 2018 to 2023, and many more besides. One hell of a CV. Now, some will be doubtless wondering why experiences of 20 or 30 years ago are not really relevant today. However, we say different. History rarely repeats itself, but it very often rhymes. And those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. And so we thought we would get Chris to come and talk with us, and Richard's going to kick that off.
Indeed. So we're going to cover 4 themes. We're going to cover performance and the state of things today. Second, whether there's a conflict between the need for pace and the match-fit nature of the industry to move at that pace. We're going to cover leadership, whether we all have what it takes. And finally, very quickly, we'll talk about relevancy, whether the lessons and the fixes of the past are relevant today. So we'll dive straight in. Chris, performance on the railway generally, what the customer sees, it's below, I think, what we'd all call acceptable levels. Ridership's coming back, but revenues are down pre-COVID. We've got cancellations that are too high still. We've got fragmentation, yet we've probably got more government control than we've ever had since 1948. IR still not where it needs to be. Unit costs are far too high. It doesn't feel great. So can we be optimistic? And are there any lessons you think from where we've been in similar positions before?
Yes, I think there are loads of lessons on performance, and the bad news for everyone in this room is everything on performance affects you. So no government's going to invest in a bad performing railway. No passengers or media are going to support a bad performing railway. So it's the absolute foundation stone in my book to get performance right. And if you want an example against myself in a way, when I launched Network Southeast, I thought it was just going to be a straight advertising and promotional and marketing campaign, and we got a big advertising agent, J. Walter Thompson, in to do it, and they refused to take the contract. They said until we'd sorted out performance, they didn't want their name associated with what we were doing, and we'd be wasting our money if we tried to do it. Big lesson in life, and they were right. So we spent 6 months and an extra £10 million, which I hadn't got, trying to put performance right. And we got there, but big lesson learned. And if you want to feel for what it was like in those days, the good news is you're much better today. So the Evening Standard on my first day at Network Southeast actually ran a leading article which said, "Welcome to London and the purgatory of grossly overcrowded trains, grubby carriages, shabby stations, and ancient rolling stock." So there was
that was the welcome to you. Oh, charming.
So the mission was to put that right, and the good news is the Secretary of State and Minister did not try and take command. They didn't take power away from us. They did exactly the opposite. They said, we are requiring the Railway Board to put this right, and every question in Parliament about it was answered by, that is a matter for the Railway Board. So the accountability was clearly with the railways, and the chairman on day 2 of receiving that accountability called me in and made me responsible for putting it right in the London area, quite rightly, because I'd just been appointed. And I said, and his magic words were one sentence actually, please do a ScotRail in London. And that was my entire remit for 5 years. And we spent 5 years doing it.
What did do a ScotRail in London mean, though, practically? Because obviously you'd had some experience and learnt some lessons trying to affect this change elsewhere first.
We'd spent 5 years in Scotland with massive freedom. We were 400 miles away from London, and we just did what we needed to do. And we got the stations and the trains and the performance and the customer service right. So what he meant was, please do all that in London and get the government off my back. And there was one rule: I must not exceed the subsidy in that. So there are envelopes and accountability, but basically you have freedom as long as you do it within the subsidy, which we did. So I, on 2 days later, delegated it down to my subsectors, of which we had 6, and they were the ones at the workface, and they were the ones who were delivering performance. So I had to find £10 million I hadn't got. We won't go into how we did that. And we gave all that to the subsectors, and they had to recruit all the 1,700 staff that were missing, because they'd been holding the vacancies to balance the budget, and thus wrecking the railway. So we put all that back, and then we had to retrain. Then we decided we would focus everyone's attention for 6 months on nothing else but performance. And I really mean that. We didn't do anything else. And it was called Operation Pride. And they had 6 quality standards. And the way I held them accountable for that was to have something called the Yellow Peril, which listed the 6 quality standards and then league tabled the routes against them. So you might be top in performance and bottom in cancellations and in the middle on train cleaning, etc. And the whole world knew, because we issued 1,000 copies of that every month, and it was pinned up on all the notice boards, and I can assure you, you did not want to be bottom. So everyone was self-motivated to get themselves up the league table and avoid relegation to the next league.
So one of the challenges that we have today is that costs are effectively managed by the Department for Transport. So they hold the cost side of the P&L. Revenue goes to the Treasury. So you talked there about not exceeding the subsidy, which was a net figure, clearly. So you could increase your cost a bit as long as you increase the revenue by more. Do you think that that net subsidy accountability is actually essential in order to be able to deliver what we're talking about now?
Yes. Everyone in this room is in a business which has income and it has revenue and it has to balance it. It's crazy if the railway is not in that position. So how did I find that extra £10 million? I took the risk I could get an extra £10 million in income if we got the performance right. That seemed to be a natural business thing to do, and it worked. We actually exceeded it. Nowadays, I suspect you wouldn't be allowed to do that. You would have to find £10 million by cutting even more off your costs. You wouldn't be allowed to use income.
And in fairness to GBR transition team and the Department of Transport, the creation of a single P&L is an objective. But so clearly a message for the Secretary of State of the Department is get to that point as quick as you can, because without that ability to manage a business, it's going to be challenging.
Yeah, and it took the railways 40 years to get to business management, and now we've undone it. It seems quite extraordinary. You cannot get people self-motivated if they don't control their business and their activity. It's so basic, and I trusted the subsectors to do that, let alone doing it myself.
But last point on this before we move on to the next section, performance is the key. So you're saying that really before you ask for anything and do anything, performance is the key. And the good news is we can control that. The industry can control that probably better than almost anything else.
Yeah, and remember, we were 40,000 people, so we had to motivate 40,000 people to want to get performance right in 6 months so we could get the money to advertise our business. And we were very open with people about that. I spent a lot of time outside walking the talk and explaining it. And there was huge enthusiasm to make it work. And I think that yellow peril did help with people like a league table.
And the lamppost really did turn red overnight, didn't they, Chris, it seemed?
Yes.
There's been a suggestion that matters are so serious at the moment that moving fast could itself cause an irreparable set of problems. Tim Shoveler recently said on Green Signals that he's concerned that our current generation of managers, as good as they are, need to be trained to cope with a more integrated new world. He has a point, I guess. Yet when you led the transformation at Network South East, pace was at the heart of absolutely everything you did. Are there lessons to be learned from NSE, or have we become so fragmented with such tight central government control it just can't be done in the same way now?
I don't personally agree with that, and I have talked to Tim about it. I think you're better if you know a big change is coming to do it fast and to get on with it without being reckless. I think the point he's making is we may lack enough big leaders, let's call them field marshals, to lead the troops. But I'm not sure even that's true. I think when we started ScotRail and Network South East, we were at a much lower base, and none of us were trained, for example, in business management to go into Network South East. So all the chairman did was to marry us up with people who were. And the same happened in Virgin Trains. In both cases, I had an expert as deputy. In Scotland, it was a civil engineer. In Network South East, it was a marketing manager, business manager. And in Virgin Trains, it was a commercial contracts director. And you can do that right through the industry and just marry people up with the skills you want. They become your future leaders and your field marshals. So I certainly wouldn't hold back long. There is a death by analysis if you aren't careful, and there was a British rail organisation called Field which totally failed to get implemented because we just spent all our time in rooms like this talking about it. With the sectors, the chairman said, we're doing it, I'm appointing 5 people to the 5 sectors, here's a remit, and get on with it. And he empowered us with the profit and loss business accounts, with the income, and the knowledge he'd support us unless we did something reckless, like breaking the subsidy. So I'm for getting on with it.
Pace is important, isn't it? And of course, when you reorganise, you bleed, and we can't afford to delay, and there's the power of visible change. But at the time, the managers were probably less qualified for changes than they are today. And yet you made it happen, you took the risk, and no one sort of let anybody down. So you're content that you could make that sort of policy work today?
I think yes, and my example will be something which lots of people in this room were involved in, which was the privatising of the railway in 3 years between 1994 and 97. Most of us in the railway had not been involved in the private industry in our lives. We hadn't a clue what the legal requirements were for long reform reports and all these other things, but we made it happen. And it happened in a controlled way. The government said what it wanted, the franchising director said how he wanted it to be run, and then the consultants interfaced with the railway to get these long-form reports written by the experts at ground level. Had that not happened, you wouldn't have got privatisation in 3 years on the 1st of April 1994. And we just scraped in with the last one.
But surely freedom to deliver was key to all that.
Sorry, say it again?
Freedom to deliver by the managers concerned, to be able to get on with it and do the job.
Yeah. So the freedom in that situation was we were all trying to run the existing railway and keep it running well, which we did, I think. And at night, most of us gave up at least 4 hours every night to do the long-form reports and the detail we had to add for the new railway. And the subsectors were actually advising on the privatisation of their own railway.
Let's move on then to just talk about sort of the third area, which is leadership generally, okay? Because that is something that's a constant across the generations. Good leadership is good leadership. It's not time limited. We've got a Secretary of State now who is clearly passionate about change. She's talked about fixing things fast. She's called herself passenger in chief. But I also know she's passionate about freight as well, because she's talked about that. Now, you've worked for some pretty strong characters. I was going through the list. Obviously, Sir Bob Reid, 1 and 2. John Wellesby, he could be quite strong. Richard Branson at Virgin as well. So you know what it's like to work for people who know their mind. What messages would you have, the lessons are there for today's leaders, when you're having to deal with some pretty strong characters who've got strong views? Is there a way of, I suppose, managing upwards? And do you have a message for Peter Hendy and Louise Haigh as to what they need to do to get the best out of everybody in the sector?
Right, it's quite a challenge. I think, first of all, we should be really pleased we've got a government that wants the railways to develop and will invest in them, but we've got to help them do it, so obviously get performance rights so that it's acceptable to invest in the railway. Then how it's done really, really matters, and that's where leadership comes in. And those leaders you mentioned, the Bob Reeds, the Wellesbys, the Bransons, were all great delegators, so they told you what they wanted you to do, and they gave you space. For example, when sectors were set up, the government said, we will give you a 5-year plan, which they did, and we worked with them on the 5-year plan. That is what you have to deliver. There's the finance to do it. Now you're free to deliver. And that went right down to the sectors, and it went down to the subsectors, and it was so enabling. Things happen massively faster because you had the whole machine moving in the direction the government wanted. So we've just got, I think, to persuade Whitehall that they don't have to hang on to every inch of how you run the railways and can start delegating. You can't run performance from the Department of Transport. You can't run business management from the Treasury. You've got to trust people. So I think the first clue is what to delegate and what to keep control of. The Prime Minister rightly kept control of the race routes in July, for example, which you would have thought would have been a detailed police affair, but he was right to do that. It was an unusual one. In normal life, you're right to delegate in that situation. So somehow we've all got to persuade the government that they will get better results if they let us loose with a clear remit than if they try and do it themselves.
So let's delve into that a little bit more deeply. So yesterday at the conference, I know you weren't here, but we heard from Sir John Thompson, who's the chair of HS2, and we heard from David Hughes, who's the CEO of East West Rail. And there was a discussion about the pace of change, of decision-making. And I can't remember which one of them said it, but it's true nonetheless. There's a systemic problem with civil servants, and in our case, the Department of Transport. It's not that they're bad people, they just can't move at a certain pace. They want everything to be 97% accurate, whereas we all know that, I mean, as long as it's not safety critical, we all know that 85% in a business environment is probably good, and we can make that decision today. Now, I've always had the view that you won't change them. The only thing you can do is take them out of the process. Is that the message for Louise Haig? If you want change, you must do things differently, otherwise this won't work.
It's definitely the message, and we can't expect to get it in one bite, I think. So we have to prove we can do things properly, and delivering TransPennine on time, on budget, for example, will encourage her to delegate more. If you want a good example of a Secretary of State delegating, I think it was Alistair Darling when the West Coast upgrade was in a terrible position. Passengers were absolutely furious. He did not try to grab control. He put his fury onto you and the SRA and other people, and you rightly passed it to me. And in Virgin Trains, my job with Network Rail and Administration was to sort out that upgrade once and for all. And you empowered us to do it. So we did it by having a meeting on Tuesday mornings at 8 o'clock every week for 3 years, and I think I only missed 4. And we insisted on the senior people from the industry joining us, and that's where the decisions were made. And a nice example where we didn't do death by analysis was when Health and Safety suddenly told us that the tilting trains wouldn't be allowed to tilt because we had no control system to decide if they were tilting or not. They were going to tilt freely around the curves like a bicycle. And whilst we were manufacturing the trains, they changed their mind. So at that meeting, in 2 hours on a Tuesday morning, Alstom said they had the solution, Railtrack said they had no money, and we in Virgin Trains, with your support, said we will have to fund something called TAS, which meant putting Belize's all down the line to Glasgow for £1 million. And in about a month, I guess, that was properly sealed and delivered. And that could not have been done through committees in London and civil servants having to double check everything we were doing. Branson supported it.
And that's absolutely right. I mean, that is my memory of that particular discussion as well. And there were quite a lot like it. But we've just got to be careful, I suppose, because there might be people in the room going, well, that's great, but that was then and this is now, and now is different. So I suppose the message of this is, well, it is, but unless we get that level of empowerment and trust, it's going to be very difficult to move at the pace of change people want. And to get that, to even begin with, we've got to start getting the basics right. Is that a fair summary?
The conundrum, if we hadn't had that freedom, those trains would not be tilting today. It would have been illegal. The Health and Safety were just saying they cannot tilt unless you've done something. If Network Rail had followed its contract, they would very happily have said it's not in our contract to do TAS, and we wouldn't have been allowed to give the money. So you have your choice.
It does require a different mindset, though, Chris, doesn't it, by the Secretary of State, the Minister and the civil servants. I remember you having a very hard time from Alistair Darling, Richard, but he didn't interfere. You were his heat sink as well, and that was surely a politically wise thing to do.
I think it was. And the question, I remember the discussion you're talking about, Chris. Alistair Darling said to me, there's a reason why I've got you, so that if you mess up, they don't sack me, I sack you, right? Yeah, and you thought, well, okay, that was pretty clear, right? But then he did do exactly what you said. He backed it up with, now get on with it. So that is really important.
Yeah. And I have said to a Secretary of State in the past, it is not your job to take the blame. You make us accountable, we take the blame for delivery. We have to accept it works both ways.
But there are real risks for a politician taking that sort of responsibility, isn't there? Say if you decide you're going to intervene and sort out, I don't know, Euston, and it doesn't work, it's your problem and not the railways, isn't it? So there's real risks for the politicians. The reality of 2024, Chris, is very different to the 80s, 90s and 2000s. No social media back then, think of that. No keyboard warriors offering helpful advice on your every move. And arguably, there's a very different kind of politics. If you're being kind, you might say there's less patience, too strong a desire to see instant results. Others less kind would say we're driven more by form over substance than ever before. Is that fair? Or do you believe that some things are as relevant now as they have ever been?
Of course things are relevant now. It's the same railway, it's basically the same people, and it's certainly the same type of problem. But I think also there are lessons about how not to do things as well as how to do things, and you can think of plenty of those. But if we're looking for the classic lessons, we've already talked about performance, that one. I'd have thought project delivery was another one we could all learn from. The East Coast Main Line was done superbly in my time. I had nothing to do with it, I just inherited it. But it was on time, on budget, And it's interesting to ask why. And I think reason one is we took a senior civil servant from the Department of Transport, and he was locked in a room for a year, and he helped us.
Like that bit.
Yes, and he helped us write the business case. And he would not let us start or put out anything to contract until we had the business case agreed and the plan was agreed, and there were going to be no variation orders. Bad news for people in the room, but no variation orders means you deliver on time, on budget. And you could more or less tell the date by the East Coast project. If they were doing Newark, I knew it was September. If they're doing Grantham, I knew it was October. And it was delivered. So there's a lesson there, and somehow we've lost that grip. So it would be interesting to compare that with ones which have gone wrong since, and hopefully ones which are coming right.
Look, there's a good few things here. We're coming towards the end of our time here. Why don't we give you at least one magic one correct question, Chris? Maybe 3 wishes. If you could change 3 things, big things, to sort of open the floodgates or remove some of the obstacles that you see now to make life a bit more like it was for you, to get things done. You were always one for employing the JFDI school of thought, of just moving ahead and doing it, and very much for seeking forgiveness after rather than permission for. So if you had 3 wishes, 3 things to change, what might they be?
I think I can get them under one heading. It's about restoring freedom to manage. So we've somehow got to persuade government that they'll have a better railway if they don't try and run it in Whitehall and they give it to the professional railwaymen to run. If the professional railway people get that freedom, they've got to accept as accountability, which means we have to stand up and take the blame, we have to deliver, and we get sacked if we get it wrong. That's how it used to be. And you get far more out of life if you can do that. And then you have the freedom to balance your costs and your revenue. And in all 3 jobs, ScotRail, Network, South East and Virgin, the big success came on the income front. The costs are pretty fixed on the railway. Income, we doubled in Virgin Trains in 5 years once it came right. And that's where we need the freedom.
And of course, it gave the politicians the confidence that they needed. If you're going to double income, you're never going to get much of an argument then, are you?
And at the launch, we invited Tony Blair and the Secretary of State to come, and it was a very happy event, and they took the credit for the West Coast coming right. Absolutely fine.
It doesn't matter who gets the credit, does it?
I have no pride.
Fantastic. Well, look, Chris, thank you. I think we've proven beyond all reasonable doubt that whilst many things have changed, and that's a fact of life. I do like the fact that in 2000 and 2004, when we were doing West Coast Route Mod, there was no social media. That would have been a disaster, but anyway. But nonetheless, core principles have remained the same, whether it's leadership and performance and basics are exactly what they were. And actually, one of the interesting things, I think we all would agree, public ownership, private ownership, it's interesting, but it's actually not really the issue. The real issue is about having that empowerment and that leadership. It doesn't really matter. So I think we're now going to move to some Q&A, so I shall hand over to our question master and we'll take some questions.
We've got a couple of minutes for questions, so if you've got any questions, can you please let us have them? And can we make sure the questions, I don't want any of that parliamentary stuff where you make a speech and then put on the end, don't you agree, thereby turning it into a question. Try and keep them short. We've got some roving mics. Who's going to go first? Now we have that business. Dare I put my hand up? I don't want to be the first to ask. They're very good. Gentlemen over here. Where's the roving mics? Coming over at a fair clip there, I'm impressed. Can you say who you are and what your affiliation is for the recordings, please?
Absolutely can. Noel Travers, Chair of RIA. Started my industry working under Chris at Network South East as a lowly management trainee. Very simple, Chris, GBR is going to happen. What's the one thing we need to do to make sure that GBR is a success and delivers what the industry needs?
You need one clear leader for it, which is the equivalent of the chairman of the railways, so that we have someone to give accountability to. Once you've got that, the Secretary of State and the Department of Transport and the Treasury can start making that person accountable. At the moment, I suspect they feel, A, there's no one person who's accountable, and B, the whole COVID experience is still over them. So if we want to persuade civil servants to give up the powers I suspect they're starting to enjoy and give them to a professional railway industry and hold it accountable, that's what we've got to do.
Well, it strikes me we've got 3 clear leaders at the minute, haven't we, at GBR, with Gisby, Hines and Hain. So let's hope that Louise and Hendy are watching this live broadcast somewhere and can take Chris's advice. Right, anybody else? Come on, you must be some. Take advantage of this opportunity, this wealth of experience sitting in front of you. Chris, you've told them everything. Clearly, nobody has got anything that they want to know. Ah, thank God. 2 here. 1 there, and then the gentleman right at the back.
Hi, Clive Castle, Rail Media Group. Hi, Chris. Nice to see you again. Chris, in your days, the railway was loss-making, but it was very efficient in terms of the amount of loss. It's almost quadrupled since then under the present privatisation arrangements and the way money is distributed. Do you ever see that we can get back to the same level of finances that you enjoyed when you were InterCity and NSE?
Yeah, it's a challenging question, isn't it? I think what privatization achieved was to make income grow really fast. So they were able to, or we were able to do things in privatization which I wasn't allowed to do. For example, in InterCity British Rail, I was forbidden to double the service to Manchester. We should put the fares up instead on the 1 train that we had every hour, not introduce the 2nd. Virgin immediately went for lots of trains, lots of income, and doubled the income. None of us were so good on costs in the private railway. So if you can combine BR's ability to cost manage, of course we'd had 30 years of being penniless, and we made every penny really work, didn't we? If we can get back to that culture and still keep the revenue growth culture and the investment, we'll have something rather exciting in GBR. I think we can do it over time.
Okay. We've got 2 last questions. One at the back. All right, 3. See, you all leave it till now, don't you? Gentleman right at the back, then Anthony Smith, and then Pino, and then we're going to have to call it a day then, I think. Nina, we might just squeeze you in if you all give short questions.
Good morning, John Richmond from Malatite Rail Signalling. Chris, I wonder if you in the panel there have any thoughts on how this supply chain is engaged now compared to how it was previously. A lot of us in the room feel a real disconnect from those that are making the purchasing decisions. And I'm just wondering what advice you could give to Network Rail and GBR going forwards to actually engage more openly with the supply chain.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that John Armitt touched on some of that yesterday, but there are 2 things you can do to help in the supply industry, I think. One is to find every conceivable way to help us improve reliability of equipment so that trains never, ever get stopped at signals and the passengers get through on time. The second one is productivity. How can we do things more cheaply? In Scotland, you found ways of saving our signalling costs dramatically with radio train dispatch, for example, where we virtually took out all the signalling on the Highlands line and saved them because of your new radio train dispatch technology. Those are the sort of breakthroughs we need there. And thirdly, to convince government we can do things more cheaply.
I'm just going to add 1 comment to that as well, if I may. It is absolutely crucial that the conversation about the future investment plans for the railway is a conversation. If government simply, if you wait for Network Rail or government, whoever it is, GBR, to say this is what it's going to be, it won't work. So we are certain, we will use our voice to say that you've got to be part of the conversation. I think the fact that RIA now is so proactive in terms of lobbying, producing reports, and and the team there do that is a terrific thing, actually. But you have got to be in a part of that conversation. So if you're not being heard, shout louder.
That's right. Darren and his team have transformed RIA in that respect. Anthony Smith, then Pino, then Nina. Just quick as you like, please, and then we're done.
Anthony Smith, Independent Rail Retailers. Chris, have passenger needs changed over the decades?
Good, nice and short.
I suspect they haven't. And I think people just want the railway to do what it says on the tin. And where we do that, and Greater Anglia is a good example today, I guess, it's suddenly come right on Greater Anglia and everyone loves it. It happened to me with Pendolinos.
Pino de Rosa,
Pino.
Thank you. Pino de Rosa Bridgeway Consulting Limited. Chris, on the 1st of April 1994, I worked for InterCity Midland Cross Country, and I was one of your underwater inspection unit divers, engineer divers. And then a year later, myself and Brian Madison created Bridgeway Consulting to provide services to in the privatised sector. What's your view of what SMEs and other private sector organisation will play in the future going forward with Great British Railways?
I guess it's the same principle. We got to free you up to come up with ingenious solutions and ideas. We depend on the supply chain to feed up these ideas up, and somehow we got to harness them again much better than we used to.
Nina
Lockwood, Intuitive Talent Solutions. Chris, whoever I speak to in the railway industry, whether they've worked directly for you or not, and have just know you by your reputation, say to me that you are one of the best, if not the best leader that the industry has ever had.
Come again.
In your view, what are the key criteria for a good leader?
For a leader?
Yeah.
It starts with knowing when to delegate and when not to delegate, doesn't it? So with the Network Southeast Operation Pride, should I be trying to do it all myself, or should I be encouraging? And I decided encouraging was the right role there. At other times, like the West Coast, it had to be command and control, I'm afraid. We just had to have that Tuesday meeting, make the agreements and force it out. And I think there's an interesting balance there between when to command and when to encourage.
Knowing when to use the carrot and the stick, I suppose, is that. But I asked Ed Burkhardt that question many years ago, and he just growled at me. Nigel, he said, you just get the very best people you can and then get out the way. Which is simple, but there's a lot there. Look, thanks for your question. Sorry to hurry up at the end there. I'm afraid that's all we got time for. Thanks to Darren and the whole team at RIA who've transformed that organisation. I've known it for many years, and it is, as Richard said, much more active and up and at 'em than it ever has been. Thank you for inviting us to the conference. I think we've had a good time, haven't we, Richard? Not quite done yet. Hopefully the technology has worked, so those on YouTube hopefully have enjoyed this session as much as we have, and we hope you have. Here at the conference. We set up green signals a year ago. This is about our first birthday, so I can't think of a better way to sell it. Well, I can't. No, I can't. And mainly because of the stellar quality of guests we've been able to invite on the show, the channel has gone from strength to strength. We're now closing in rapidly on 10,000 subscribers, plus we know many more that listen in regularly. We're here for the industry just as much as for the more casual listener, so please do tune in. You can find us on our own channel on YouTube or on your Spotify or your podcast provider of choice, Podbean or Apple or whoever. And please let us know what you think. Don't forget to like or subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can listen to us on those other audio things, whichever one you want to do. But for now, thank you once again to the wonderful Chris Green for joining us today and for being such a brilliant guest. And thanks all of you here at RIA for listening and not throwing anything this morning. That's been a great experience. And for listening on the platform of your choice. It just remains for me to say that it's goodbye from me and...
It's goodbye from me.
Thanks for being with us. Natasha.
Well, hello. That was part of history, wasn't it? Chris, thank you very much indeed. That was truly fascinating. And as you said, that was history making. I'm fascinated how two men who have really reached the tops of their professions decide to do a podcast. Why? Amateur.
I know. I was just testing, seeing if everybody was aware. Well, look, I'd edited Rail for 28 years. Richard had been in the railway and a long time had been out, but we're both Lancashire lads. We've remained friends ever since. And when I was leaving Rail after this sort of 28 years of editing a fortnightly magazine, I can't honestly remember, Richard may be able to, who mentioned podcasts first. I think Richard said, what are you going to do? I don't know, there's podcasts, there's all sorts of things. And then at the end of September, when I'd actually left, Richard rang me up and said, look, we've got to do it. And within a month, we had the first one out, didn't we? And we did it to keep ourselves in there. The bit I enjoyed about being on Rail the most, and as a journalist, I'm sure you'll relate to this, it's the networking, it's the knowing, it's the talking to people who know what's going on and being able to talk to them and listen to them, and they listen to you if they've got time for you, and we've worked hard at that. So we launched it, and here we are.
I just thought it'd be quite fun to be able to have an opinion about railways and not be accountable anymore. So I thought that was going to be fun, and it has been.
And it's really taken off, hasn't it?
It has. It's taken us. I mean, I wasn't looking for another full-time job, to be honest, but it's brilliant. When you start a YouTube channel, they tell you that you'll start qualifying for ad revenue when you've got 1,000 subscribers, and that'll take 22 months, and it took us 3. So it has been really stratospheric, and the numbers are just brilliant. But what's made it is Richard and I are just lucky. We've got 35 years-ish each of experience in the railways from very different viewpoints, which means we can ask a lot of questions. And fortunately, people like Chris and Anthony and the various other people in the room who've done us the very great honour of coming on the show and answering questions, and people want to hear what they've got to say. And it's very immediate, of course.
And it's rather lovely working with somebody who you respect, I guess.
You must try it sometime,
Well,
Richard.
we tried, but he wasn't available, so...
he ended up with me.
No, it's been fantastic. What we try and do is we have a bit of fun as well. You've got to stay professional. We do take the mickey out of each other a bit. But as Nigel said, I think the really important thing for us is the quality of guests we've had on, and that, in the end, we didn't set it up to be sort of as a vanity thing. We actually wanted to make a difference. We have two very, very different audiences. We have a lot of people who are interested in the sector. They might be what we'd all call enthusiasts or so on. But we also know a lot of people from the industry listen in, and that's great. So we will always be unashamedly pro-rail, pro-industry. We're not fawning. We will challenge. We will be tough. But we do say to people, if you want to get a message out, because we can say the things that you perhaps can't say. You're thinking, but you can't say them. I'll give you an example. So yesterday we heard about East-West Rail and discontinuous electrification. Now, personally, I think it's barking not to put OLE up on the entirety of East-West Rail because it's a strategic route. It could be a strategic freight route. Now, we will always, if we say that, we'll always evidence it and support it. We won't just say it. But we can say some things that perhaps others can't. And if it can be a service in that way, then that's great. But we're always going to have a bit of fun
And
as
we
well.
can give time for the debate. It's not 20 seconds on the Today programme. People can have a long-form conversation with us.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask you about your kind of most treasured guests in a moment's time. But green signals, where's that from?
Richard's wife thought of it, to be honest. We were casting about for a title, and Richard rang me up and said, I think Madeline's got it.
Yeah, it really is that. It was sat over the kitchen table one night. Got to come up with a name, and two old blokes from Lancashire didn't kind of do it. So, and she said, well, it's all about positivity. Green. There's a nice thing with climate there, but it's all about every driver I've ever spoken to, what they want is green signals all the way. That's good news. I just thought, yeah, that's it. That's
and it
great.
works.
Well done to your wife, and thank you for giving her the credit, because quite often people don't.
She's much brighter than me, I can tell.
As a journalist, I'm always asked, who's your favourite guest? What's the best story anybody's ever told you? So go on then. Who is your favourite guest, Richard? You can start. Not favourite.
Well, it's
okay. Favourite's the wrong word, isn't it? Who is the guest that you've enjoyed interviewing the most? Who you found most stimulating?
Let me cop out on that one while Richard answers. The one we're interviewing at the time is usually an answer, because everybody's got a story to tell. It was on Green Signals. I interviewed Terence Cuneo, the artist, some years ago, and he was wonderful. But
I don't know. This is going to sound like back in my old job, actually, of sort of answering the question in a very sort of non-answery sort of way. Honestly, it's hard to find a favourite. They're so different. And we're very honoured that the people who've said they'll come on. I mean, we had Hugh Merriman one week, and then we had Mick Whelan. And you kind of go, wow, they've got a slightly different point of view on life. But both generous with the time, both terrific, didn't dodge questions. And that was great. I honestly I've loved them all. I've loved them all. There have been some, I tell you, one of the hard ones to do was Sir David Higgins. So I interviewed Sir David Higgins a couple of weeks ago. And the reason it was hard was because he has that way of, when you ask a question, his brain is going at such a pace that he answers the question and stops. right? There's no waffle, right? So you've got to be ready for the next one. So that was quite difficult just because he was so good. But honestly, Natasha, they've all been terrific. We've not had a duff one yet.
In fact, Mick Whelan wrong-footed you a couple of times, which I found amusing.
I think we'll move swiftly on from that.
Oh
if
no,
that's okay.
come on! I don't want to move on.
I can't remember exactly what it was. And certainly towards the end of the interview,
He remembered something that had
did.
happened at Virgin Trains when I was chairman there that I might have misremembered. But anyway, that's fine. As I say, moving on.
You never really know, do you? And it's sometimes those that you're not at all expecting to be really interesting that really surprise you. I mean, for me, I've often been, you've interviewed, pop stars and politicians and prime ministers and presidents, and actually it's just, normal people that are the most interesting. They've got the best stories to tell.
Absolutely.
And you do interview women as well, don't you?
Do you know we did one?
One?
No,
he's going to talk about one particular feature.
So we did one particular feature. Avanti West Coast they'd been given a bit of a kicking in the press over an issue relating to the menopause and work that they'd done with their staff to support women going through the menopause. And we saw this piece and thought, that's not on. That's not fair, the way that they'd been treated and the people that were just trying to do something really good. And then somebody else who was an expert on it had posted on LinkedIn about it. And it was a really sensible piece. So we got Avanti on, so the lady was leading the project, and this expert from LinkedIn, and we had a piece on that. And I genuinely didn't think that would be the kind of thing we would, when we started Green Signals, I didn't think that we would do. It was a brilliant piece. It shone a light on something really, really important. And for me, it was important because it said there's nothing we can't talk about, and it's good to talk about these things. So, that's a good example. We're not just interested in trains. We want to talk about the issues that affect people in the industry. And so, yeah, we'll do anything.
The worst interview?
The worst interviews are the ones where and this applies to a lot of them again, people who really know what they're talking about, and you've got to get your A game out and really do the research. You can't just turn up for one of our interviews, I'm talking about Richard and I, and then just do it. You need to know what that person's done, because they will make a fool, or you'll make a fool of yourself.
While you're thinking, should I tell you one of mine?
Oh, go on.
I think one of the only, possibly the only time I got into real trouble was with Richard Branson when he was running his tilting trains, and he came in and I asked him a question he didn't like, and I got a formal complaint at the BBC.
Result?
Yeah, I considered it a bit of a success, but yeah, never mind. There was something, I think people
You didn't complain, did you? It wasn't you.
Was it you?
I bet it was.
There we go. I put it as a question, but actually, this is a confrontation.
I'm now slightly concerned, because there were a couple of moments when you would get Richard on the phone going, can you deal with that? Because that's outrageous. I don't think it was.
I don't think it was you. You're all right. Go on, you can answer the question now.
I honestly can't think of one that's a worst interview. I really can't.
An embarrassing moment, we were interviewing Hugh Merriman in his office, and it was before this has been such a journey, learning about how this tech works. Because we're kind of getting on a bit now, right? So learning how this stuff works. And so we were using these kind of cameras, and they overheated, and so we had to stop, and I had to say to Hugh, terribly sorry, we're just going to have to let the cameras will have to cool down a bit. He was brilliant. That was very stressful.
It's mortifying, isn't it, when tech doesn't work? Any questions from the floor? Are there any delegates who'd like to volunteer themselves to be interviewed in the next Green Shoots podcast? Green Shoots, I'm sorry, it's not Green Signals. Green is because you talked about the environment. Green Signals. There's a lady at the back. Are you volunteering a question, or are you telling us that our tech's wrong? I don't know whether there's a question coming from the back or not. Any other questions? So who have you got your sights on then? Who's next for you, Richard?
So Louise Haigh has told me that she would come on at some point before the election. So what we need everybody to do is get on social media and
at Lou Haigh,
and say, yeah, you need to come on Green Signals. I think she's terrific as to chat to. I think it should be absolutely fantastic. So if you could help us with that, that would be really good.
That would be good.
That's the one we are quite keen to do. Yeah.
And the voice of the consumer, I mean, obviously they're talking about the big wigs in the industry. Do you speak to regular people as well?
We tend to speak to their representatives. Anthony here has been on the show. He used to be chief executive, passenger focus, transport focus. But yeah, it's all for them, you know, and for the freight customers, the people who use the railway. And we regard ourselves as their proxy, if you like, as Louise said about, you know, passenger in chief. We want the railway to succeed. We want it to be better. As Richard said, we're not afraid to ask the tough questions, but we will always bat for a better railway for them because they pay for it, either through their fares or through their taxes. They pay for the railway and they deserve better than what they've been getting in a lot of cases.
This is a bit of a loaded question, just because I was due to stay last night, but I ended up having to go home to be with my daughter. And I got caught in the worst hold-up.
Here we go.
Yeah, at London Bridge. And I just felt like it was ironic because, you know, here I was in between 2 days of the most amazing kind of superstars of the industry, and the voice of the passenger is so important, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, the railway is the biggest and most complex machine we've got with moving parts from John O'Groats to Land's End, and it relies on tens of thousands of people turning up every day and doing the right thing at the right time, and they get tripped up by exploding gas mains and trees falling across the line and weather and all the rest of it. And they are brilliant when the backs are against the wall. It doesn't always feel like it when you're stood waiting for your train.
But that's the key. Things will go wrong. Right. I mean, having been involved in rail operations, in complex, things will go wrong. It's how you respond to it, how you communicate, how you deal with people when it does happen. And I think, by and large, the industry does get that right. When it doesn't, it needs to learn from that so it can improve the next time. But communication and care is...
And that's why it's such big news. It doesn't happen that often to that degree, but it is too often.
Yeah, not last night, but I will tell you something really lovely, a story quite a few years ago. I just missed my train. It was very late at night. There was an empty station. It was Clapham Junction. I don't want to get anybody in trouble at all. However, I got to the platform and the train that I needed had just left the platform, and I spoke to the signalman and I was like, no, that's my train. And he's like, I'm sorry, love, it's gone. No, can you please call it back? And he's like, no, I'm so sorry, you cannot call it back. And so I was, you know, it was like a little bit fed up, but he said, well, would you like a cup of tea? I'm going to get myself a cup of tea. And so we had a bit of a chat. I went off and got a cup of tea, knowing that the next train was like an hour to wait, and it was dark and cold. And then he came up to me, I gave him his tea, and he just said, don't say anything, but get on the next train. I've put an extra stop in for you so that I could get home. Yeah, it works sometimes. But what you were saying, this industry is full of amazing people that want the best, don't they, for their consumers. Sometimes they get tripped up by tech and all the things that we all have to deal with, and there's always the appetite to make things better, but it's full of people who actually care about their jobs. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I'm sure you're going to get lots more subscribers after this
Let's hope
event.
so. Thank you, Natasha.
So remind everybody how to subscribe.
On the YouTube Green Signals channel, you just click the button. It's as easy as that.
But if you listen to it on audio, which a lot of people do, then it doesn't. If you've got a podcast provider of your choice, Spotify, Apple, it works on all of those. You can just subscribe there.
And it's totally free.
And it's totally free. There you go. Well, thank you very much indeed to both of you for such a brilliant start to day 2 of this conference. Thank you so much. Okay, so I told you earlier on, didn't I, that our schedule's been